Hello, I'm TheCosmerian, and welcome to Tiny Talk. This podcast episode is a particularly interesting one because this is actually a re recording of a Tiny Talk episode that was supposed to go up last month, and I borked the recording settings. And so I self corrupted the recording, and now we're re recording the whole thing. So if it sounds like we are more prepared than you would normally expect, um, that's because we are doing the whole thing over again, basically. Um, but this episode is on removal, and it's just how removal works in this format and how is it different from other formats and all that interesting good stuff. Of course, I am the Cosmerian, and with me are three very special guests. Let's start by introducing ourselves and give us a little fact about yourself. Because this is a removal episode, I always don't use enough removal because I come from Commander where that is the norm. And also, why play removal when you can play actually interesting and fun cards? The answer is because you can't win the game if you don't have removal, because removal is very important. But I don't learn that lesson, even though I've been playing this format for like 3 years now, and removal is very important in the format. I still kind of always go when I'm looking for cuts. Oh, what's like the minimum amount of removal I can run, and it still be reasonable. But let's move on to Nushio.
An interesting fact. So, the first time I entered a Tiny Leaders tournament, I was using my Doctor Who precon. Not quite a precon, I made a couple changes. But I very quickly realized that I was also not packing any removal. Every card I faced was scary, whereas mine were just common cards that you would find in a precon.
Lovely. And on to Skitter.
Hi y'all, I'm Skitter. A little fact about myself. Hmm, let's see. As far as removal goes, I do play a lot of it, but I am typically a combo player, so I play less than I should.
And Wizard.
Hello, I'm Wizard. Much like Skitter actually stole my fun fact. Uh, um, even it like primarily being a 60 card player in like Modern and Pauper and stuff like that, I'm still very much a combo player. I think we're all like a little bit hypocritical right now talking about removal, and none of us play enough removal.
You know
but
what? We'll roll with it.
we, we still have credentials. Trust us. The source, trust me, bro.
Okay, let's get into it. This first question is a fairly basic one. However, from the last talk, spoilers, it was a bit of a divisive one. But we want to set a baseline. Okay, so in this format, it usually applies to other formats as well, but we're talking about tiny leaders here. In this format, what would you count as removal? What's like your definition, and what are the edge cases that you would say is removal or isn't removal? So, off the top of my head, counter spells, hand hate, stuff like discard, tapping your opponent's creatures, tapping and stunning your opponent's creatures. What counts? And we'll start with Nushio.
If you ask me, removal is getting rid of the threat. Um, Stunning doesn't really get rid of the threat. Removing it from the board, imprisoning it with like a pacifism or betters, and or returning it to the hand could be considered as getting rid of the threat. Discarding as well, but for many reasons, I would say removal counts as sacrificing or dealing damage or a board wipe.
And Skitter.
Yeah, so I think removal is literally picking up a piece of cardboard that your opponent has put on the table and moving it somewhere else. Whether that be, I do technically believe that removal, or sorry, let me rephrase that. I do technically believe that bouncing is a form of removal, even though it is temporary. But it is literally taking that piece of cardboard and putting it into some other zone.
And Wizard.
And we are all much more agreeing tonight than we were the last time we did this. Yeah, it's removal is I see threat on board. I do not want threat to be on board. I'm going to spend a card to take the threat off of the board, be it bounce spells like into the Flood Maw or like just the more standard removal of kill that thing like Long Goodbye, but yeah, it is threat is on board. I'm spending a card. That threat is no longer on the board.
Yeah, to me, I think it gets a bit more complicated. Sorry to like ruin the synchronicity that we have. Um, for me, I'd say removal is somewhat dependent, right? So like, being able to cast pacifism could be removal if you're pacifying a Barrogoyf, because Barrogoyf only matters if you can attack or block, otherwise it's not relevant. But obviously, pacifying something like a Ral Monsoon Mage doesn't do anything. And so, I will say this is largely a deck building based episode. So, for deck building purposes, I would not count something like pacifism as removal. I would count something like counterspell generally as removal. Um, Stuff like Inquisition of Kozilek gets a bit complicated. Um, I I generally end up counting it as a piece of removal in my deck. Um, whether that is correct is up for debate, but again, as I said in the intro, I like to run as little removal as possible so that I can play as many fun cards as possible. Which means I go, Inquisition of Kozilek's removal. That's fine. We'll take it. Um, is that correct? Probably not, but that's something that I do. And now let's open up the discussion. What do you think about each other's thoughts?
I do want to jump in here. I would say that Inquisition and Thoughtseize effects are definitely not removal, considering your opponent has not spent mana on those things just yet. One of the draws to removal for me in this format is that mana exchange of your opponent casts a spell, it comes into play. They've used, let's say, 3 mana in the case of Barrogoyf, and then you use 1 mana to remove it, and now you're up mana.
Yeah, and I think that kind of gets into the like philosophy of card advantage and mana advantage, which, is something that you don't particularly think too much of if you come from something like Commander. However, in 1v1 formats, those two ideas are very much there if you're talking about like deck philosophy and like gameplay philosophy. I think there are certain archetypes that care more about one or the other. So like control cares a lot more about card advantage than mana advantage, but something like tempo cares a lot more about mana advantage than card advantage. And so, you know, I don't know if those two things necessarily apply um like directly to what counts as removal. I think for if you're talking about from a card advantage standpoint, Inquisition of Kozilek and Doomblade are quote unquote the same. However, that obviously changes if your opponent has no cards in hand, in which case one is clearly better than the other. Um, And then if you're talking about bounce effects, that provides mana advantage, but it's card disadvantage. So that's another wrinkle of, you know, in some decks, that's what matters. In other decks, it doesn't matter. A control deck does not want to play a bounce effect because it is taking them down one card and just setting your opponent back a turn. But something like a tempo deck or a combo deck doesn't care that much. They just care that it is not there for the turn that it is not there for. And so in that case, it would be removal. But I also don't know if that's like a correct metric to be measuring things as a it depends mindset. I also think there's a difference between interaction and removal that we could also talk about if we want to.
Oh, 100%.
Sure, interaction is hard to measure. I mean, most of the games you're interacting unless you're like building a pillow fort. Um, but for removal, I would consider this card as removal, particularly cards where maybe you're trying to discard creatures or you're trying to discard non-lands or stuff like that. You're targeting something that would have affected you. And even though they didn't spend any mana on it, you're removing the choice of the casting. The threat will no longer be able to be placed on the board. Hopefully, unless they have a way to resurrect it from the graveyard.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. Absolutely. Uh, it, hmm. This is definitely where it gets really complicated to define exactly what removal is, because I guess in some situations, a hand spell could be considered removal. Like you removing it from their hand makes it so they can't cast it. Like that is removing their option. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But at the same time, I do think a huge draw to how good removal is in this format is that mana exchange, which you don't really get from Thoughtseize effects.
I will say though, and this is, getting into the next question, so I'm not going to touch too much on it, but this is a 3 mana format, which means that that mana advantage is a lot harder to have huge swings in. Because if somebody hard casts, I'm going to say a card that you should never hard cast. If somebody hard casts Gristlebrand, um, and somebody just removes it, with murder, let's say murder, that's a huge mana advantage swing. Now, Gristlebrand, ignore the fact that Gristlebrand proceeds to draw you a bunch of cards, and so it doesn't matter if it's removed. For the sake of the argument, we could replace it with Phage the Untouchable or something. But um, it is something that costs a lot of mana that you can remove for very little mana, and therefore the mana advantage is a lot bigger than spending 3 mana on a Barragoyf and then your opponent spends 1 mana on a Swords to Plowshares. That's just 2 mana that you're up on. So it's a bit of a weird case. It's why tempo decks are really tough to build in this format and really tough to have be good. That's English. Um, but yeah,
Uh, while I would agree that tempo decks are very challenging to build in this format, I would actually disagree that the mana swings are smaller and tiny. Purely numerical wise, yes. Like I'm spending 1 mana to answer a 3 mana thing, or I'm spending 1 mana to answer a 2 mana thing. But 3 mana is the top of our format. The difference between 1 and 2 mana and 3 mana in this format is massive. Whereas, like, let's take an example. Like Pyrogoyf in Canadian Highlander. That is a 4 mana spell. Some people will remove it with, a fatal push. Whereas you are spending that 1 mana to answer a 4 mana thing. Um, it is still a big swing not everything in Canadian Highlander is going to be that much of a blowout. And because the mana costs are so low in Tiny, the actual value you get out of a removal spell that goes up on mana is going to be comparatively much larger than it would be in another format. Is that making any sense?
Unfortunately, it's making a lot of sense. Yeah, this is absolutely why I'm not a tempo player. You can kind of tell because I didn't think about it in the sense of, yeah, it really depends on the speed of the format and it really depends on the curve of the format. Something like Canlander, I I know that the curve is higher because they have access to all the cards. I think it's a bit slower. Um,
Yes, it is.
okay. I'm glad that I'm correct on that.
It can still be fast, but
Yeah,
it
yeah,
is still a turn or two slower on average from
yeah.
my experience at least.
And actually, let's talk about something like standard, which is like, you know, solidly slower. Um, that's yeah, you're totally right that because of the curve and because of the speed of the format, it doesn't necessarily matter that that shouldn't be put into account when talking about mana advantage. But also, yeah, I'm I'm not a tempo player, so don't take any of my philosophy as law.
I guess let's go ahead and put it into like more concrete terms. I think I didn't
Yeah.
explain that super well. So I think I would like to think of it as essentially like mana opportunity cost almost. Your opponent spends an amount of mana. How much mana are they expected to spend? In a Tiny Leaders format, that could just be another one mana threat that they didn't get to cast because they had a poor interaction between like a Barragoyf and a Fatal Push. Um, it's the opportunity cost of I've cast this and that is so much of my mana for the turn, my allotted like mana allowance for the turn that has been wasted now.
And you'd like value that when you're talking about like what is removal, um, more highly than just pure card advantage.
It depends on the deck. I hate giving the it depends answer again.
Yeah.
But yeah. um I would value that like opportunity cost very highly in this format because like let's say you're playing against Rogdog. Like if you have a poor mana exchange against that deck, sometimes you just die. Like that is something that will happen very consistently.
Yeah, for sure. Um, let's put this into more concrete terms. So, when we're talking about what counts as removal, let's talk about like commanders. Does Liliana of the Veils uptick count as removal? Does the downtick count as removal? And does Lagrella's ETB count as removal? For reference, Liliana's uptick is each player discards a card. Downtick is target player sacrifices a creature. And then Lagrella's ETB is a Fiend Hunter style effect of enters, exile a creature until this leaves the battlefield.
I would agree that the downtick of Liliana and the Lagrella like ETB exiles something until it leaves, but those are both things that I would count as removal. The so removal is really just like a subcategory of interaction as a whole, you know? Like counter spells, hand hate effects, discard spells, like all that kind of stuff, bounce effects, the and removal all count just like in the general like interaction bracket, right? Um, and then the Liliana downtick being like a Shieldred's Edict on like a Planeswalker body, you know, uh, they still get to pick what they're removing, but like it's still removing something, you know. It may not be targeted removal, but it is still removal. Whereas
Yeah.
the uptick is just like, oh, they discard a card. You don't even get to pick what card they discard. It's kind of just sending your opponent back on resources rather than actually removing something.
And here's a more spicy example. Are we counting Orcish Bowmaster's ETB as removal?
I mean, it
I
can be,
would.
I guess. Sorry, you can go ahead, Nushio.
I definitely would count it as removal. Um, in fact, if we go by like Scryfall standards, Scryfall has the tagger system, which is like a crowd-funded tagging system. It allows people to choose and vote for which cards get which tags. Um, and so cards like Liliana do have the removal tag. So like I guess the crowd has spoken.
Yeah. Um, and yeah, I would say generally, we'll get into this when talking about our third question. But like, yeah, I will admit generally I do count something like Orcish Bowmasters in my like removal quota. Um, I I think it depends on the deck on how much I'm counting those edge cases as removal. Um, but I think we've probably yapped on this particular point a little bit much, but I will give each person an opportunity to, if you want to say something, to just close out your thoughts on this. Feel free.
Yeah, I mean, Orcish Bowmasters is definitely removal. It might be only a single damage, but you can remove something. Um, Something small for sure, but something. And it is tagged as targeted removal.
Yeah, we're gonna see Nushio doing a lot of just answering answering questions by saying, "Well, according to the masses."
I am data driven, and we did get the Scryfall integration up and running this morning,
Yay!
officially. So like, I'm super excited about having Scryfall being able to search for tiny leaders card using like the F tiny or F tiny leaders to not sound so crass. F as in format. And well, yeah. The fact that the tagger crowdsourcing system has already done the homework of deciding what a card counts, whether a card counts as removal or not, is I think it's very neat. It might it 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 means that for many decks you end up with more removal than you thought because maybe you didn't consider something as removal, but it turns out that your deck actually has more removal than you thought because the cards do count as removal, such as Orcish Bellmasters.
Yeah. And I think this is a good time to move on and talk about this question from like a related but separate angle. And that is, how impactful is removal in this format in comparison to other formats? And we'll start with Nushio.
I think it's extremely impactful. I see tiny leaders as quite literally a tit for tat. If you skip a turn because you were just holding your mana to see if something bigger would come up, you are way behind. And so removal does count in terms like Barrowgoyf, which has Death Touch. You might not be targeting what gets removed, but it can remove pretty much any creature as long as they deal damage to each other. And therefore it is a big removal threat. Barrowgoyf is player removal Yes,
Oh
for
no.
sure. Sorry,
We're
misread
not
that.
gonna get into is creature attacking removal, but
I mean, sure. You deal with the opponent and you remove them from the board.
yeah, player removal.
Yeah.
Um,
Player
okay.
removal is the best removal.
Yes.
Agreed.
Okay. Skitter, what's your thoughts? How important is removal in this format compared to other formats?
Oh yeah, I feel like I kind of touched on this already a little bit, but I think it is extremely impactful. Removal is definitely one of the most important card types in this format, especially considering we get a lot of premium removal that other formats really do not. Um, Cards like I've already gone on record saying that I'm kind of a long goodbye hater, but I've begrudgingly put it back in some decks because it kills things with ward. But all of the like 3 cost and less removal spells are just absolutely at a premium in this format, and it just doesn't really get much better than how many incredible removal spells we have in this format.
Absolutely. And Wizard.
So, piggybacking off of Skitter a little bit, I would say that removal is incredibly important in this format, more so than other formats, because of the quality of threats that we have access to. Um, we are a Baragoi format, we're a Flage format, we are a format with all these like incredible threats that will end the game like 2 turns after they hit the board. Um, so we kind of have to find ways to just we have to find ways to deal with it. Long goodbye is a very good way to deal with a lot of these threats. Any of these like destroy target creature CMC 3 or less is now suddenly just more efficient removal of any creature in the format. You know, um, yeah, the removal is incredibly important in this format because without it, like you're just not going to catch up to your opponent.
Yeah. I'm going to add like an extra little wrinkle and say I'm not going to be so absurd and say that removal is like this format is one of the most important formats for removal, but I would say that this format, because of that mana value restriction, has this interesting weirdness where basically every win con is going to be removable in some way. Um, you're not going to see a lot of winning via instants or sorceries. Um, and also, you're not even going to see a lot of winning via enchantments or artifacts. Most decks are going to be running creatures, and that is going to be their win con. Um, Even control decks, like one of the premier control decks in this format is Aminato. Their like singular win con is Entreat the Angels, where you just make a bunch of creatures and go sideways. Um, and so having almost every threat in the format be removable, and then having some of the best removal in Magic, and then even better removal when we're talking about 3 or less things. Uh, that means that removal is kind of one of the most vital pieces for your deck. You can't really run a deck, even like pure combo decks, something like Light Paws, is running like, at least in my Light Paws deck, I think this is me spitballing, I don't have it on me, but is running something like 6, 7, 8 pieces of removal in the main board, because you just need the removal. It's something that is necessary for the format, and it's necessary in fairly large quantities, which we'll get to in a later question. And now I'll open up the conversation.
I don't know. I feel like we're all like pretty much on the same page for this. Uh, there's I don't know if there's much conversation to be had here. There is yeah. removal is very important for your format. Removal is very important for your deck in said format if you plan to succeed. No notes.
Yeah, I mean, think about this. What kind of deck would play no removal whatsoever? You're pretty much playing like I guess some sort of a mono red, mono green stompy deck where you don't care what your opponent is doing. You just build something big and hope to smash face really quickly. Um, but I bet even those like you have to pack removal and there's really no avoiding it.
Yeah, and I was going to say, oh, well, my favorite deck ever, Grist Bugs, um, which I've made a video on. You should check it out. Um, but Grist Bugs runs very few removal, even though technically Grist does have a downtick that is removal. But, if you have Grist on the board, you're already winning, so any removal is about, okay, is there something stopping Grist from being on the board? Um, but even that one runs one actual removal piece and two kind of removal pieces, and that's only because um that's basically the maximum amount of removals pieces it can have with such a limited deck building restriction. If it could have like 8 or 9 or even like 12 removal pieces in the deck, it absolutely would. It's just limited by its very specific restriction.
But I'm sure even in the Chris deck, some of the bugs could count as removal. I don't quite remember the deck list, but if there's any bugs that have like sacrifice, remove an enchantment, that's a bug that's actually doing double duty.
That is true. There is quite a few insects that remove an artifact or enchantment. There's just not a lot of creature removal. But yes, you are absolutely right. That artifact or enchantment removal is removal. And so if we are considering that in Grist Bugs, suddenly the number jumps from like 1 removal piece to something like 8 or 9 removal pieces. So there you go. There you go. Okay. Well, it seems we are pretty much in agreement with that question, so we're just going to move right along. For the third question, where we were kind of just talking about it, but let's get into it more. How much removal is too much removal, and how much is too little removal? And we'll start with Nushio.
So I actually, for those that don't know, I have the website TriomeLab. It's a website that I started to help players play Tiny, or if you're already playing Tiny, to build better decks. I've been gathering deck lists from every Tiny Leaders tournament I've been able to get my hands on. It's still not enough, but it is a baseline. Um, and with that out of the way, I have data from every deck grouped by either color identity or by commander. And I can see that there's decks with 32 pieces of targeted removal and decks with 0. Like, what counts as removal for me, once again, is if Scryfall says it's removal, it's removal. I won't discuss that. If it could be a board wipe, it could be targeted removal. But if it's removal, it's removal, right? And so if we go by color and average things out, because obviously there's gonna be weird decks with like 36 pieces of removal. Um, if we go like by average, the highest is gonna be black, green, red with 20 average pieces across 131 decks that I have on the system. But what looks more normal is around 14 pieces. And in fact, the least amount being blue has 12 pieces of removal on average per deck. And I know the number might be very shocking to, well, it was for me, but do remember that just like with your grist example, you weren't initially counting the insects as removal. but they are removable. They're removing artifacts and enchantments. So even though it's not their focus, you didn't put them in there because you needed to get rid of the enchantments. They count as removable because in case of emergency or whatever, they do double duty, right?
Yeah. And we'll move on to Skitter.
Yeah. So, how much removal is too much removal? Um, I really hate to give the it depends answer again, but I feel like I'm gonna have to for this question as well. Just what decks are you playing against? Like, if you're playing against Aminatu Control, well, removal's not necessarily gonna help you that much. You'll sometimes just stare at a Fatal Push sitting in your hand, and you're like, wow, this card's not very good against, a Planeswalker, with that as their main win condition. But if you're playing against something like Rogdog, like I mentioned earlier, then removal is going to be incredible. You want as much of that stuff as possible. You want to not die. I want to not die. Yeah, removal is going to be incredible there. It really depends on your matchup spread. It really depends on just really what decks you're playing against.
Love the it depends answer. Wizard.
I really have to go with the contextual answer as well.
Harumph.
E- like to even like further that point, what what decks are you playing against, but also like what are you playing, right? Because sometimes like you're playing like a Balmore red blue prowess deck, and you're not exactly like you only need to remove enough things to get your creatures in and kill them, right? You don't necessarily have to like immediately like nuke threat on site, you know? Um, so I think it's still incredibly contextual for me and for the decks that I play. Usually, my interaction suite as far as removal is somewhere between like 12 to 16 cards on average. Again, I don't play as much removal as I should. Kids, eat your removal. Um, but um, for me personally, it's about 12 to 16 cards on average per deck.
Yeah. And I'm going to say that, yeah, I think it's incorrect to say, like, this specific number is too much removal and this specific number is too little removal. So instead, I'm going to give a range. So I would say the minimum range that I'm usually comfortable with is something like 6 removal pieces. And that's if I'm playing combo, if I'm playing, like, something that doesn't care all that much about getting rid of and disrupting my opponents, I'm going to go with like 6 removal pieces because I don't care all that much. Then on the higher end, if you're playing something like Control, I'd go with like 18 removal pieces. If you're playing hard Control, that can go up higher, but usually that's the range that I'm happy with. So somewhere between 6 and 18, I usually average for something like a mid-range deck. In the middle of that, at being around 12 removal pieces. Obviously, that's lower than the average that Nushio said, but not to say that I don't trust Nushio, I would say that the data can be sometimes, because of the Scryfall tagger, sometimes it can be a bit generous with what it counts as removal. And, in some decks, you could be running a card and not counting it as removal because it doesn't count as removal for the deck you're playing against, or the deck that you're planning on playing against, or the deck that you're playing. So, you know, like the pacifism example. Would I count pacifism as removal? Maybe. But, yeah. So, 6 low end, 18 high end, 12 middle end. But let's open up the conversation. What do we think as a collective?
Yeah, I think those numbers sound about right. When I'm building a deck, I'm not looking at the numbers from Scryfall. I'm also looking at the interaction pieces. But the way I like to build the decks is using like the architect model, where you have a card that's grouped into several blocks. So this card can do two or three or four things at once. And so I might have it as, counters, as in plus one counters, but it's also removal if I remove a counter and I can deal one damage, like the Walking Ballista. Um, but Walking Ballista, I wouldn't count it as removal when I'm doing the deck math. And that's how these numbers from the Scryfall slash deck list came up so high. What you as a deck builder consider removal, just as you said, it's not necessarily matched with the data that I have.
I guess I'll add on to kind of an earlier point that Nushio made, surrounding just the variability of the purpose of cards placed in your deck. Um, I like obviously I would definitely consider cards like Mawloc removal, but like that's not the only thing they do. Um, it's very important in this format, especially since we only get 49 cards, to have a lot of overlap with the roles of what cards do, what cards' purposes in your deck are. And I think the higher amount of removal in our format is definitely contributed to by just how many cards serve multiple functions.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the main way you play this game is by interacting with the opponent. So removal is one great way to interact with your opponent. That's I think why we pack so many ways to interact, be it deal damage or stun or whatever.
Yeah. So I'm just taking samples purely from my deck list that I make and main. So Light Paws is a very low removal deck. In my list, I counted in just a brief count, I counted exactly 6 removal pieces. Um, Lagrella is more of a mid-range deck. It is running something like 13 removal pieces. Plagon's a control deck, but it's a bit weird because it's a control deck with 10 bajillion ways to draw cards. And so it is running like 12 removal pieces, which is low for a control deck, but it also has an absurd amount of card draw. And so usually you are going to be drawing like 10 out of those 12 removal pieces in any given game. So yeah, that's just like putting application to my theoretical standpoint.
Going back and looking at some of my decks as well, I'm looking at the Infect brew that I have, or Infect in heavy quotations. There are two cards with Infect in it. Um, but I realize I'm running Fatal Push in the sideboard, and Berserk is my only main board removal spell. Daze and like Blossoming Defense, but Berserk is literally the only card that can remove something in my deck.
Yeah, I will say that for both my Lagrella example and my Plagon example, I included counter spells as removal, which is a big, point of contention. But for my deck purposes, they work well enough. And also, again, my chronic ways of finding excuses to run less removal because counter spells, I think of them as both removal, sort of, and also protection of just removing my opponent's removal. And so I like them. But yeah. Um, do we have any further thoughts? We good to move on?
Yeah, I'm good to move on.
I am as well.
Same.
All right. We were touching on this a little bit. Um, but let's go more into it. What are some non-standard removal pieces that are unique to this format? So this is something that, like, obviously, this is an Eternal format. There's, in any Eternal format, we're going to have the same card pool, minus, bans. And so, technically, none of these removal cards that we're talking about are going to be unique to the format, but, like, uniquely playable in this format, or at the very least, are more playable in this format because of how the format works. And we'll start with Nushio.
So I mainly play. Well, I play many colors, but I guess one of my favorites is like Portable Hull, or the Portable Hull equivalent, the enchantment Seam Rip. Um, I wouldn't say they're unique, but they're tiny. You wouldn't play those in, I guess, Commander or other formats where there's way bigger threats. But in Tiny, in every deck that I can fit a Portable Hole or a Seam Rip, I probably will, and they have a place in my heart.
Yeah, and Skitter.
Like we mentioned earlier, all of the removal pieces that destroy something specifically three, or destroy or exile something specifically three mana value or less, those are very obviously extremely good and tiny. Um, yeah, I don't really have much else to add there. I know this is something I technically mentioned the last time. Um, but sorcery speed removal is a little bit more playable in this format than it is in some others. It's a little bit more desirable here rather than in a place like Modern, where you get a place of every single card, and you kind of, if you don't interact at instant speed, sometimes you just kind of die. Um, Here in Tiny, like, oftentimes the play pattern manifests itself as like, oh, I play a Psychic Frog, pass the turn, or I play Sorcery Speed Threat, pass the turn. With a few notable exceptions like Broadside, but Sorcery Speed removal is by and large extremely playable in this format.
Yeah, for sure. And Wizard.
I would say one of the more, so we've already touched on the things that destroy or exile something CMC 3 or less, or interact with something CMC something tiny or less. I'd say that, like, possibly one of the more efficient pieces of removal in Tiny that still technically still sees play in other formats like Modern and Legacy, but is particularly efficient in Tiny is Fatal Push. Um, because we Fatal Push has access, or Tiny Leaders still has access to stuff like fetch lands. We still have access to Lotus Petal. We still have plenty of ways to trigger the revolt on Fatal Push. And then at that point, it is like, if you can trigger revolt, it is 1 mana, destroy any creature in the format that doesn't already have indestructible. Versus I mean, Long Goodbye still is destroy anything in the format and is even uncounterable, but still 2 mana. Um, and as Skitter has highlighted a couple of times, the mana exchange in this format, going the difference between 1 mana and 2 mana is quite large. Because the speed of the format already puts us in the mid game on like turn 2 or 3. Um, so having access to a 1 mana kill anything is pretty good.
Yeah. And for me, um, I'm going to say that, yeah, obviously anything that cares about mana value is going to be particularly good. And actually, something like Abrupt Decay is one of the reasons why this format was created. Charlotte, who we've had on the podcast before, but who's the creator of the original Tiny Leaders format, part of the reason why she decided on 3 mana or less was because of cards like Abrupt Decay that care about specifically 3 or less mana. And you kind of see that printed time and time again. There's, more that is like now 4 or less, so something like Skyclave or Fatal Push. But um yeah, and so I'm going to just like list out some of them. For future me's sake, I'm probably just going to put insert card I'm talking about here and not actually put in the card. So if you appreciate when I like hover in the cards that we are specifically talking about, I'm not going to do that because I'm listing 10 bajillion cards and I would die. So, you have in white, you have stuff like March of Otherworldly Light, you have Skyclave Apparition, you have Prismatic Ending. In blue, there's not actually that much in blue that cares about mana value, I don't think. Um, in black, you have stuff like Eliminate. Something that's blue and black is like Drown on the Lock. Or black and green, we already talked about Abrupt Decay. There's Anoint with Affliction in black. And again, red, there's less of that sort of thing. And green, there's less of that sort of thing. But, you have these cards that care about mana value specifically that are particularly playable. I will say there's another wrinkle. There are cards like Ghostfire Slice, which is really good. And cards like Mawloc, which I don't think sees. I don't know about other Eternal formats how often Mawloc sees play there, but overall the format, the power and toughness because of how many cards we can, how limited we are on the number of creatures and the power and toughness of those creatures. Usually something like Ghostfire Slice or like who's their face? Broadside Bombardiers. Those will mostly get rid of any creature you want them to get rid of, and so they are extra playable. Obviously, something like Lightning Bolt is very playable in every format that it's legal in, but it's extra good here because most creatures, the vast majority of creatures, are toughness 3 or less. So yeah, some food for thought. And now let's expand thoughts on each other's thoughts.
Yeah. The fact that there's so many cards that specifically target 3 mana or under has been one of my joys because it means that it shines in this format. Like it absolutely shines in this format. It's um I'm glad that Wizards has been printing so many of those cards and that Charlotte decided to use that as a benchmark. Prismatic Ending is probably one of my favorites because you can run it on 3 colored decks and it can get rid of like most any threat on the board. Sometimes for cheap for 1 mana. But you have the option if you have the colors. And yeah, I mean I agree with you with the choices of the different colors, the removal.
I want to build on the fact that Charlotte made this format with the intention of cards like Abrupt Decay in mind. I am just so grateful that we don't have to worry about some of the nonsense 4 drops that are in this game. Like, imagine this. Well, I can imagine a format with One Ring in it. That format would probably have One Ring banned. But I'm just so grateful that we don't need to worry about some of the nonsense that 4 drops allow.
Oh yeah. Yep. I am so glad. We do these like kind of um silly sub formats in the community. And so one of the formats is like I think it's called Bigger Leaders or whatever, which is limitation of 4 mana or less. We haven't played that in a while, and I think part of that is because there's a lot of cards people don't want to have to deal with for 4 mana specifically. 4 mana is kind of the threshold of things get silly. Pyrogoyf, 4 mana. One Ring, 4 mana. If you remember it's time and standard, which it might matter less in an Eternal format, but Shieldred, 4 mana.
I think One of my
So, yeah,
favorites is Wrath of God. And I
this
do
is
think
true.
it's pretty funny that we do have a legal Wrath of God on Tiny Leaders in the form of Damned, with its overload cost.
Ooh, another one. Armageddon's 4 mana, isn't it?
I think Armageddon's 5, but I might be mistaken.
No, just checked. It's 4 mana. I'm so glad we don't have to deal with Armageddon in this format. Imagine how many more cards would have to be banned if this was a 4 mana or less format.
Just you wait till I bring Lurrus Smallpox.
Oh, man.
I'm gonna be the devil on the shoulder. I think that a 4 mana format could actually be kind of fun. I like when I first got into Tiny Leaders, I was like, oh, I know exactly what I want to build, and then I rushed to the commander that I wanted to build at the time, which was the Necro Bloom, and much to my dismay, the Necro Bloom is 4 mana, and I said, damn, can't make my funny Abzan Dredge deck.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the community formats are for. We're currently I think we're currently on the server playing Vintage Tiny. But after that, if you want to sponsor a 4 mana or less Tiny Leaders event, that's something that could be done. It's a fun time. It's something that I'm glad isn't a mainstay, a like permanent uh, rule in the format. But as a fun little experiment, absolutely.
Or we could do 4 mana commanders, and then everything else is still 3 mana. Call it small leaders.
Maybe, maybe.
Maybe we're brainstorming. Anyway,
I would
Or
I'm getting off
finally,
topic.
I
we are
would
getting
finally
off
be able
topic.
to play Amy Rose. I have it, but I can't play because I know it's tiny.
Okay. Um, so it seems that we've derailed a little bit, but it also seems that from the previous question, we're all like in agreement on like which cards are particularly playable, and we highlighted most of them. So let's move on. This is the last question, and that is, what are some of your favorite pet removal cards for this format? And we'll start with Nushio.
Well, I accidentally set my pet favorites previously, which are like Seam Rip and Portable Hull. I like them because they're very efficient and they don't they don't really well, many players don't really have removal or don't care about them enough to remove them. Um, but I think my favorite removal spell has been, I think it's called Out of Time. It phases out every card and then it puts time counters on it. And if you play your cards right, well, phasing does not return the commander back to the command zone because it does not actually move zones. So it's one way to get rid of your opponent's commander without being able to recast it. And so I'm gonna go for that one.
And Skitter.
I am a massive fan of the card Molten Collapse. There's a lot of we colloquially call it Moose, but Marith. There's a lot of Marith in this format, and that's a Hardened Scales deck. Uh, Molten Collapse, just being a 2-for-1, is so good. As far as other like pet favorite removal spells, I don't know if I can really call Witherbloom Command a pet removal spell. I just really like 2-for-1s.
Oh, yeah. Also, isn't technically Molten Collapse a Rectos card, which is not legal in Moose?
No. I'm talking about against Moose.
Oh, against Moose. Yep,
Yeah,
that's
it
that's
removes
that's
both
fair.
Moose and like Scales or something.
Okay, yeah. And Wizard.
So Nushu actually kind of beat me to the punch a little
Oh
bit.
no.
My so Out of Time is not my favorite, but my favorite removal spell is my favorite for a similar reason. And my favorite removal spell is actually Oubliette. This is a very bad card. Do not play this card. It is very bad. It is so much fun to play. Um, it is just like single target Out of Time that doesn't get time counters. so it's just on the board, phase something out until this thing leaves. Um, and I think it's so much fun to just put their commander under the oubliette, put them in baby jail, and uh, they just, if they don't have enchantment removal, which enchantments are notoriously a little more difficult to remove, um, sorry, you're in the oubliette.
Yeah. And I will say, I will actually counter you. I love Oubliette as well. I think you should play it in specifically the sideboards of mono black decks. I put it in the sideboard of mono black decks as much as I can because it is so fun, and also there are a few decks that just cannot function without their commander, and there are also other decks that cannot get rid of enchantments. So if that happens to be both decks, like if you're playing against Gut, uh, good luck. You're in Oubliette jail. And so it is cool for the sideboard of mono black decks. You probably should not play it anywhere else though. But my favorite pet cards, one of them is Oubliette. Another one is Gilded Drake, and this is specifically in Lagrella. It is bad in anywhere other than Lagrella because Lagrella can then Fiend Hunter the Gilded Drake, and then when Lagrella leaves, the Gilded Drake comes back and gets its effect again. But in every other deck, a 3/3 flying is still very much a threat. And so even though you still get a good deal with trading Gilded Drake for something like Barrogoyf, it's not the best deal. But it is a pretty cool thing in Lagrella. I'm noticing a pattern, which is we really love it when we can take away our opponent's commanders. And I will say that is like absolutely just a joy to be able to do in any sort of commander format. Is the thing that you always theoretically have access to, you no longer have access to. And the last pet card is not removal, but it's kind of removal. And that is my almighty Sunstrike Legionnaire. At some point, somebody should create like a little counter of how many times I mentioned Sunstrike Legionnaire in the Tiny Talk podcast, because I think I mention it like once every podcast or something like that. I just love the card so much. But it's not removal. However, it does kind of act as removal for some decks. You know, if you're playing against Arabella, just tap, tap, tap. Your Arabella can't do anything. Playing against a Barrogoyf, tap, tap, tap. Your Barrogoyf can't do anything. So, I don't know. It's not removal. You shouldn't count it as removal. I kind of like it as stopping things, as being interaction. But let's open up this conversation to other folks. Anything that you failed to mention, anything that you want to say that, do you want to say that other people's pet cards are bad? I don't know.
Okay, so I did forget about one. Thank you, Skitter, for reminding me. So Legion Extruder is another pet card of mine, but Legion Extruder made me think of what is probably actually my favorite removal spell, which is not a removal spell, but it is a
Love
spell
that.
that makes more removal spells, which is weapons manufacturing.
Oh yeah.
I I
Nice line.
I love weapons manufacturing. It's so goofy. I can't make it work in this format because I only get one of them, and there's only one card in the entire game that makes munition tokens. And do you want to guess what it is? It's weapons manufacturing. Uh, I have this weird brew for a Rakdos Duretti like artifact aristocrat list. That's very bad, and the entire list revolves around weapons manufacturing being on board because you have to sacrifice a bunch of artifacts for value. And there are some pretty good artifacts to sacrifice for value. You still have stuff like Simulacrum Synthesizer and Clockwork Percussionist. Like you still have some good artifacts to sacrifice for value. But the idea is you're still sacrificing munition tokens, and then you're playing more artifacts to make more munition tokens. And I don't know. Weapons Manufacturer, I guess, a special place in my heart. It's such a goofy card.
Also,
I did meet Experimental Synth. Thank you, Skitter.
um, actually, here's another pet removal card that is probably not a removal card, but kind of a removal card. And it's not really a pet removal card, it's actually like a pretty popular sideboard piece. I just love Disruptor Flute. It's such a fun card. Um, and sometimes I play decks where I just put it in the main board because I love it so much. Uh, and it's not removal, but it kind of is. It stops your opponent from using their commander, which seems to be a common thread of things that we all love doing. So I do just love that that seems to be just like a common thing among all of us is just yeah, anything that can stop the commander from being a commander is good removal.
Yeah, it because it takes me back home. I'm playing Modern and Pauper most of the time. You don't get commanders in those formats. Like I'm just returning back to the square one for me.
Ooh, another piece of removal I forgot to mention. I guess technically by my definition of removal, it isn't removal, but unable to scream. It is like a pacifism effect that also removes the text box. It's kind of removal. I don't know. Again, the definition is so wishy-washy.
I would say that Unable to Scream is maybe the one card of that effect that I can like almost like if I squint hard enough can count as removal, right? Because if I just tap something down, but that creature just still does something when something else happens, like it still has like triggered abilities, pacifism doesn't care about that. It just cares about whether or not that creature gets to attack or block. Unable to Scream removes the text box, and that is now a blank vanilla 0/2 artifact creature on the board. Uh, I hope you had +1/+1 counters on it previously, because otherwise that card's useless now.
Very fair, very fair. Removing the text box. We found the link.
Yippee. Okay, do we have any closing thoughts?
Play more removal.
Play more
If you
removal.
think if you think you have enough, you don't. Just add one or two more pieces.
I will not listen to that advice, but I should.
The ideal Tiny Leaders deck is 1 Swamp and 49 Fatal Pushes.
That is not true.
Who's the commander for this theoretical deck?
Fatal
Fatal
Push.
Fatal Push, yeah. Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love it.
Okay.
I mean, at the rate Wizards is reprinting cards, it wouldn't be that surprising if by the end of 2027 we do end up with like 20 different fatal pushes, fatal push likes.
All right. And with that, I think it's time for us to close out the episode. Yeah, as everyone said, play more removal. Removal's a big part of the format. We love removal. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this Tiny Talk episode, and thank you very much for the three of my guests who struggled really hard to get this recorded. We have really tough schedules, and it didn't help that we had to re-record it. So this is like probably like between 2 and 3 months in the making. So I am very glad that it finally got done, and cross our fingers. If the audio gets corrupted, I'm going to cry, but otherwise, thank you all and stay tiny.